The Rise and Fall of Samuel Doe, former president of Liberia. Hello explorers, welcome back to another interesting video presented to you by the Explorer, and thanks for watching. Pride, they say, comes before a fall, but was that the case of the former strongman of Liberia, or was there a more mystical power at play in the shadows? In this video we shall discuss the rise and fall of Samuel Doe, former president of Liberia. Samuel Canyon Doe was a Liberian politician who served as Liberian leader from 1980 to 1990, first as a military leader and later as a civilian. More than a quarter century after his demise, Samuel Doe continues to cast a long shadow across Liberian politics. But who was he, and how powerful can one man's decision be to tilt the country into the future? The best way to understand a man's strength is by digging into his upbringing to uncover his drive. But first of all, if you're new here, welcome. Be sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on any of our subsequent videos. On May 6, 1951, Doe was born in Tucson, a small inland village in Grand Gede County, into a family that belonged to the Kan people, a minority indigenous group important in this area. At the age of just 16, Doe finished elementary school and enrolled at a Baptist Junior High School in Zwedru. 2 years later, he enlisted in the armed forces of Liberia, hoping thereby to obtain a scholarship to a high school in Kakata, but instead he was assigned to the military duties. Over the next 10 years, he was assigned to a range of duty stations, including education at a military school and commanding an assortment of garrisons and prisons in Monrovia. He finally completed high school by correspondence and was promoted to the grade of Master Sergeant on 11th October 1979, making him an administrator for the 3rd Battalion in Monrovia, a position he occupied for 11 months. By the 1980s, Doe was probably tired of serving as a Master Sergeant, or the dominant role of the Americo-Liberian over the minority ethnic Liberians, and decided to change the history of Liberia forever. Commanding a group of Crown soldiers, Master Sergeant Samuel Doe led a military coup on 12 April 1980 by attacking the Liberian Executive Mansion and killing President William R. Tolbert, Jr. 26 of Tolbert's supporters and 13 members of the cabinet were publicly executed 10 days later. Shortly after the coup, government ministers were walked publicly around Monrovia in the nude and then summarily executed by a firing squad on the beach. The convicted were denied the right to a lawyer or to any appeal. Hundreds of government workers fled the country while others were imprisoned. After the coup, Doe assumed the rank of general and established the People's Redemption Council (PRC), composed of himself and 14 other low-ranking officers to rule the country. The early days of the regime were marked by mass executions of members of Tolbert's deposed government. Doe ordered the release of about 50 leaders of the opposition Progressive People's Party who had been jailed by Tolbert during the rice riots of the previous month. Shortly after that, Doe ordered the arrest of 91 officials of the Tolbert regime. Within days, 11 former members of Tolbert's cabinet, including his own brother Frank, were brought to trial to answer charges of high treason, rampant corruption, and gross violation of human rights. Doe suspended the constitution, allowing these trials to be conducted by a commission appointed by the state's new military leadership, with defendants being refused both legal representation and trial by jury, virtually ensuring their conviction. Doe abruptly ended 133 years of Americo-Liberian political domination, which was a pile of mixed reviews. Some hailed the coup as the first time since Liberia's establishment as a country that it was governed by people of native African descent instead of by the Americo-Liberian elite. Other persons without Americo-Liberian heritage, such as Henry II Wesley, had held the vice presidency as well as the ministerial and legislative positions in years prior. Many people welcomed Doe's takeover as a shift favoring the majority of the population that had largely been excluded from participation in government since the establishment of the country. However, the new government, led by the leaders of the coup d'etat and calling itself the People's Redemption Council, lacked experience and were ill-prepared to rule. Doe became head of state and suspended the constitution, but promised a return to civilian rule by 1985. In August 2008, before a Truth and Reconciliation Commission (TRC) in Monrovia, Doe's former Justice Minister, Councillor Chia Chiapo, alleged the American CIA had provided a map of the Executive Mansion, enabling the rebels to break into it, and that it was a white American CIA agent who shot and killed Tolbert, and that the Americans were responsible for Liberia's nightmare. However, another former minister of Samuel Doe, Dr. Boima Fanbule, testified that the Americans did not support the coup led by Mr. Doe. Some facts of the 1980 coup are still clouded by reports of an unknown soldier, as this reported that an unknown soldier was one of the white mercenaries who would have staged the 1980 military takeover of the state. According to the autobiography of Tolbert's wife Victoria, the First Lady witnessed a masked man with a knife hand-stabbing her late husband. This dust of confusion over the origin of the coup has never settled, but how DOE led the country is still crystal clear today. During his rule, DOE portrayed himself as an enlightened leader whose actions were intended to bring relief to many. DOE's new government briefly flirted with Libya before aligning firmly with the US. This position was rewarded with massive foreign assistance from the administration of President Ronald Reagan and the state's visit to the White House in 1982. Furthermore, until 1985, Liberia was the largest per capita recipient of US aid in sub-Saharan Africa, receiving more assistance from the US in 1981 to 1985 than over the entire previous century. The United States valued Liberia as an important ally during the Cold War, as it helped to contain the spread of Soviet influence in Africa. But by the time rebels Charles Taylor and Prince Johnson moved to overthrow DOE at the twilight of the Cold War, this support had evaporated. No constitution and 1985 elections. After drafting a constitution for a multi-party republic in 1983, approved by the referendum in 1984, he went on to stage a presidential election on October 15, 1985, in which DOE won 51% of the vote. DOE had the ballots taken to a secret location and 50 of his own handpicked staff counted them. Also, prior to the election, he had more than 50 of his political opponents murdered, and it is also alleged that he changed his birth date from 1951 to 1950 in order to meet the new constitution's requirements that the president be at least 35 years old. DOE was formally sworn in on January 6, 1986, a ceremony which was an obvious show of DOE's victory over his opponents. DOE publicly declared that if he lost the elections, he would not hand over power and the army would carry out another coup in less than 2 weeks. General Thomas Kwiwonka, who had been a leader of the 1980 coup along with DOE, attempted a failed coup on November 12, 1985 and was killed. DOE's corrupt and totalitarian government became even more repressive after the attempted coup, shutting down newspapers and banning political activity and promising execution for anyone seen after 6 p.m. The government's mistreatment of certain ethnic groups like Geo and Mano in the north resulted in divisions and violence among the indigenous populations, who until then had coexisted relatively peacefully. This tribal bad blood led to one of the worst civil wars in the country. Charles Taylor, a former ally of DOE, crossed into Liberia from the Ivory Coast on December 24, 1989, to wage a guerrilla war against DOE. Taylor had broken out of jail in the United States, where he was awaiting extradition to Liberia on charges of embezzlement. The conflict quickly fled into a full-fledged civil war, and by the mid-1990s, most of Liberia was controlled by rebel factions. This friction led to killings and even the Monrovia church massacre of 29 July 1990, in which it is said approximately 600 civilians were killed at the church in the Sinkhole section of Monrovia. The massacre, carried out by approximately 30 government soldiers loyal to President Samuel Doe, were mostly Kran, while most of the victims were Geo and Mano tribes. General Quino, the head of the ECOMOG, invited Doe to the ECOMOG headquarters for a meeting and assured him of his safety from the rebels. On the morning of September 9, 1990, Doe arrived at a precarious time during an ongoing change in guard duty from the well-armed and better-equipped Nigerian team of peacekeepers to the weaker Gambian contingent. The Nigerian team had just withdrawn from the scene when Doe's convoy of light-armed personnel arrived. Doe was escorted to General Quino's office, where he was formally welcomed, while most of his team of aides and guards waited outside. Johnson's rebels surprised everyone by suddenly arriving on the scene uninvited and heavily armed. The barely armed Doe convoy and the weaker Gambian contingent stood no chance in this scene as they were overwhelmed and disarmed. Then they started shooting Doe's team individually and later in groups. Upon hearing the gunshots from outside, Doe expressed concern to Quino, who assured him that all was fine. Quino later excused himself to check on what was happening outside, followed by his aide, Captain Coker of the Gambian contingent. Both men took cover upon assessing the situation, while Johnson's men moved indoors, finishing off Doe's remaining team, shot him in the leg, and took him captive. When the dust settled, over 80 of those men lay dead, a scene described as a brutal massacre and not a fight. Remarkably, none of the ECOMOG personnel were shot in the carnage. Doe was taken to Johnson's military base, and to prove that he was not protected by black magic, Johnson ordered Doe's ears to be cut off in his presence. Shackles were also placed around Doe's legs, and something strange was tied around his glands. Doe was forced to get up, and some of his fingers and toes were also amputated. After 12 hours of torture at Johnson's hands, Doe was finally murdered. His corpse had its head shaved and was exhibited naked in the streets of Monrovia. The spectacle of his torture was videotaped and seen on news reports around the world. After effect, With a turn to the word karma, one can truly assert that Samuel Doe faced a huge one when the turns of events are examined, but there are also those who favor his rule. Having discarded with Tolbert, Doe became Liberia's first president of exclusive indigenous heritage, but met an even less dignified end than his predecessor. His reign ignited the Civil War, which burnt 13 years on after his demise. The overthrow of Doe led to supporters of his, such like Prince Johnson and former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, to rise fast to political prominence. Decades after his demise, Doe's party, the National Democratic Party of Liberia, is no longer a major political party, as it carries the stigma of the past over its shoulders, and it does not help that most of the party is predominantly Kran. The party was even deregistered in May 2014. Not all Liberians see the man himself with malice, as many believe that Doe and his predecessor were targets of a big game fostered by the US government. Youth such as Sally Guy continue to hold Doe in high regard, as she refers to the former president as one of the best leaders, adding that those that have degrees are not even half as good. Nevertheless, Doe's time in office is more commonly seen as a dark period in Liberia's history. There you have it, explorers. That was the rise and fall of Samuel Doe, former president of Liberia. Thanks for watching this video, and if you did enjoy this video, do well to give it a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe and share it with your friends.